All right. So, have you ever thought that your project was thriving, only to discover that your contributors were not sticking around, or your team's contributors weren't sticking around? My name's Andrew. I am a developer content strategist, and also I moonlight as a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, where I teach in the Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy, and also in the English department, where I teach people who are required to take my class, mostly software engineers, and who are frustrated about the fact that they have to take my class at the beginning of the semester, but they realize ultimately what I'm teaching them, things about understanding their audiences better, makes them better at what they do. And that is kind of what we're here today to talk about. I'm here to talk to you about a few specific things, some truisms about understanding contributors, and you'll sort of pick up a theme from listening to me here over the next few minutes that I believe that understanding your audience is the key to everything, and I think that that's something that's often taken for granted, that we know our audience super well. So that's the one thing. We'll sort of double down on what we can learn by learning and focusing upon our audience. And then I'm going to show you a paradigm I'm calling the hidden insight iceberg, right, with some sort of layers of information that will help you think about different ways to evaluate the insights, the data, the stuff that you're tracking. And finally, I'll show all this sort of come to life through the shape of a case study. In this case, it was some work that we previously did with Meta open source. And when I say we, I mean Catchy. I'm here on behalf of Catchy. We are the leading developer marketing agency, and I've answered this question about maybe 3,000 times over the last 2 days. Developer marketing is we are helping bridge the gap between product, which is existing software, and the software people who are interested in using them. This is a technical audience, so we're basically trying to figure out how to make sure programmers, developers find and sort of adopt tools, right? So the other elephant in the room here, though, is what is developer content strategy? Sounds like a buzzword. I know when I say I'm not an engineer, and when I'm talking to the engineering-heavy audience here at an event like this, they picture something like this with the crayons and the colored pencils, right? I know what my colleagues think that I do. That's something like a paleontology of audience, where I'm like digging up archives of past civilizations and how their developers were adopting products. And the clients imagine me as somewhat of a cartographer, sort of imagining that I'm drawing this magical map from obscurity to widespread adoption. There's bits of truth in all those things, but the reality is these sort of basic truths of what a developer content strategist does are, I understand the audience, right? I spend most of my time researching and thinking about who your users are, creating audience personas and insights around those people. And I use that to map their journey, right? When I say a journey, I mean awareness all the way through adoption. Oftentimes in this sort of universe, this involves stuff like case studies, proof points, maybe some more technical content that falls in between, like, hello, we exist, and here's our documentation. And I think 4 times out of 5, that's where people tend to drop off. So a lot of that analysis of the journey is a part of what I do. And I also research the content, the types of content that people care about, right? Content covers a lot of stuff. It includes everything from technical documentation to blogging to videos to educational content, even to the resources that live on your website or your developer portal, right? So I'm looking at all that sort of stuff, and I'm using it to plan and oversee the production of it. And ultimately, that leads to a lot of strong cross-functional collaboration. But in particular, audience really, really matters in the OSS world. So let's talk about what I mean when I'm talking about audience here. I think across the top you see the truism here, happy contributors leads to healthy projects, right? But in this case, our audience is sort of a smattering of contributors, maintainers, and users, sort of by nature leads to a challenge here, which is that maintainers are so focused on shipping code that there's oftentimes less focus on understanding your contributors, right, and understanding their experience. And there's some risks with this, right? This leads to you over-indexing on surface metrics, things like stars and forks and pull requests, right? I don't want to belittle those things. Those are great ways to take the temperature of what's going on, but I think over-indexing on them can be misleading, because this often leads to, not understanding what's going on, just saying like, hey, we have good numbers, or our numbers dropped off, or whatever, but that doesn't really tell the whole story. So investing in understanding these audiences will lead to stuff like better onboarding experience, healthier usage, and ultimately some stronger adoption. So, as promised, I'm going to start with a couple of truisms about your audience. First of all, contributors decide how much attention to pay. Right here you see a picture of peppermint oil. You may have this at home in your medicine cabinet, or there may be some peppermint extract somewhere in your kitchen. I would venture to guess that most of you don't read the labels of this very closely. It's hard to get people to read the label of something that they use very often. If you were to look closely at peppermint, it's poisonous in the wrong content. Like, too much of it can make you sick. In fact, there's an example of a time when there was some peppermint that was intended to be diluted in cooking, and people were looking at it and thinking, this looks like food, and they were eating it, and it was making them throw up. You are probably wondering, what does this have to do with open source, right? Your contributors decide how to allocate their attention, and if they think they already know, they're not going to tune in. How do you get somebody to read the instructions on a food that they've been handed since they were kids, right? They're like, I already know how to do this. I don't need any more insight on this. And the problem in projects is if something looks familiar, they skim or they skip it, and they may miss actually what's the key differentiator about it. And what's worse, if they've skipped what they think is the context and they were wrong, and it doesn't work, then they're not going to think, oh, I better look more closely at the documentation. They're going to think, this tool stinks. It doesn't work. It said it was going to work, and it's not making sense, right? So they will look deeper if they think that it's worth their while, right? But as you all know from buzzing around this conference for 2 days, if something doesn't look like it's worth a developer's while, they won't even stop and look, right? So the challenge here is that a first-time contributor may look at your README closely, right? But a veteran might think they already know, and if this caused their pull request to fail, then you're not getting their attention. It's not working. And worst of all, your metrics don't tell you about this, right? It may look like it's popular because people are visiting it, but if it's bouncing or if they're landing there and then it breaks, you don't have that insight. So your biggest challenge as far as your developer audience is concerned is not ignorance. I would argue that it is false confidence sometimes. Okay, truism number 2. Here you see 2 very different types of users. One person is cooking using a cookbook, right? And the other person is learning something and studying using a textbook. These take 2 different processes, right? If you've ever opened up a cookbook, and I think we've all Googled recipes and seen this lengthy backstory about how so-and-so's grandmother used to make this recipe, blah, 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 we're a little bit annoyed. And we're like, all right, what is this? Get me to the ingredients and the steps, right? Similarly, if you've opened a textbook and you're trying to understand why something works, and all it is a bunch of steps about something, and you're not explaining you why it matters, it's harder for you to learn because you're not getting the information that you're looking for. You know where this is going. The same thing is true with your contributors, right? If they're trying to solve a problem, like how to do something, and you're giving them a bunch of context, they're going to be frustrated, right? If their goal is, why didn't my build work? Or how do I configure this exact specific thing? They're probably looking for copy-paste commands or setup scripts or error handling. And if you give them all this in-depth analysis or explanation content, they're going to bounce, right? Because they don't care. This is like, what is this? I'm trying to do something. I'm not here to study this. But on the other hand, right, if somebody's interested in figuring out why was this designed this way or how is this going to fit into my stack, they need stuff like architecture diagrams or explanations of trade-offs or examples of integrations. And if all you've given them is code snippets, they're going to be equally frustrated, right? So this friction happens when there's a mismatch of expectation. If somebody's trying to fix a build error and all they're getting is high-level doc stuff, they're going to be frustrated and they'll leave. And also, if they're trying to understand why your project matters and all you're giving them is snippets, they're going to miss the big picture. So my advice to you through this truism is to understand the difference between whether your audience is reading to do or reading to learn, and make it clear up front what type of information that you're giving them, right? And where your metrics might look fine because people are landing on the page might still not actually tell you the story, because if the intent didn't match up with the resources that you're giving them, it may lead to frustration or mismatched of traffic numbers versus usage numbers or something like that. Final truism here before we get into the more exciting stuff of seeing this sort of come to life in 3D is the notion that contributors are actively interpreting information through their own stack or through their own experience. So if I were to say, all right, I want you to draw a picture. I'm imagining an animal. It's got 4 legs. You can ride on it, and it's indigenous to Africa. Maybe I am thinking a camel, and you may hear those same exact words and think I'm talking about an elephant, right? Both of those 2 things meet those same experiences, but they meet those same descriptions, but your past experiences may shape you to think more about one or another, right? Maybe you've seen an elephant recently, right? Or maybe you've ridden on a camel before, and you may be sort of biased by your own experiences. You guessed it, the same thing is true with your audiences, right? If only it was as easy as to me say there's this passive flow, or I explain something and you understand it and interpret it in the exact same way I've explained it, because our experiences mirror each other so perfectly that you can easily understand it, right? But that's not the case, right? Everything they've done before, their assumptions, their mental models about how this is going to work, past projects they've worked on, past tools that they've worked on, all those things are bouncing around in their head, which leads to this paradox that if you don't give them any context, they don't know where to begin. It's a bit like being dropped in the desert and not knowing where you are and even which direction to start walking in. But if you assume the context, that this is equally challenging, right? Because sometimes they're going to miss the requirements. They're going to fill in those own gaps with their own they're going to fill in those gaps with their own mental models, and this is going to lead to abandoned pull requests or incorrect usages, right? I think this comes to life if I say the same quote here about what I've got. My resource could be interpreted 3 different ways by 3 different people. For example, this repo is production ready. If I'm a beginner or a new developer, I'm going to think, great, copy paste code. This is going to work as is. Awesome. If I'm an experienced contributor, I might think, that sounds stable, but I bet it's hard to customize, right? Because it's pretty already fit and set up. And if I'm a data scientist, I might think, all right, this must come with a Python package, and if it doesn't, it's completely useless to me, right? All 3 of those people are looking at the same product with my same information about them and reaching a different conclusion about what this has for them. So remember, your project resources aren't just being read, they are being interpreted. So don't just document features or processes. You need to frame them against what your contributors are likely to be assuming and make this explicit. Make the implicit explicit. Anticipate mismatched mental models and then explain why and give them more context, so that's way you can move beyond some of these measurables. Cool. So I promised you an iceberg metaphor, and here it comes. I am a big Titanic enthusiast after all. I was just a kid when that movie came out, and we've all been enthralled with it for the 20 plus years since then. This is a familiar metaphor to us, right? When we see an iceberg, we've heard the cliche. We see what's sticking up above the surface, and maybe if the water's clear, you can see a little bit through into what's below it, but it's really hard for us to tell just how deep the iceberg goes and what's down there. So in this analogy, our visible insights, what's visible from the surface about our tool is stars and forks, pull requests, number of contributors, the number of views, the number of releases you've had, right? And this might be a good barometer of what's going on, but it doesn't, as I've said now ad nauseum, it doesn't really explain why people are engaging or where they're dropping off. We're all pretty used to these traditional implicit data that are supporting these things as well. These are things like analytics on your docs, or repeated questions that come up in your forums, or pull request feedback loops, or requests for specific examples of things, right? And I think these do paint a pretty good picture, right? But these alone oftentimes aren't showing you what's really beneath the surface in this iceberg, and I think that's where this really gets interesting, right? The hidden insights, these are things like abandoned pull requests or undocumented workarounds or the sentiment that's going on off of your platform. What's the chatter on Reddit or Slack? What are people tweeting about, or what are people talking about on Stack Overflow? Or sometimes other interesting things like people are using your project in an unintended way, right? You may not realize there's another feature, another sort of cool thing that people have discovered about this, and it's not making your way into the way that you're explaining it. Or sometimes also the dreaded quiet disengagement, where you have the same number of active daily users, but they're not as involved as they were, and they're sort of dropping off without you really being able to detect that. So let me show you an example of the potential misalignment, the difference between what we see at the high level of the iceberg versus the real story. Imagine a scenario where we have an open source machine learning model deployment tool, and we're going to look starting at what's above the surface. We see forks and stars are rising steadily. Great, right? We have an active and regular release cadence, and our analytics to our quick start guide show good traffic and a low bounce rate, right? And we have repeated requests for more advanced tutorials coming. So it would be pretty reasonable for us to reach the conclusion that adoption is growing steadily, developers are succeeding with the local installs, and they are ready for more advanced examples. So I guess we should probably invest our resources in doubling down on beginner to intermediate tutorials, right? Maybe. But let's look one level deeper and see if there's something different going on in this hidden level. In this case, looking more closely, there are abandoned pull requests. In this case, contributors are attempting production level deployment and they're abandoning it, right? There are issues that are coming up on GitHub, dependency conflicts between Kubernetes and GPU drivers. And on Reddit, people are saying things along the lines of, this runs fine locally, but it keeps breaking in real-world scaling. Or people on the Slack help threads are saying, like sharing workarounds with each other to help figure out things, hacks to make it work that are never making their way into your documentation. Flipping back to this initial analysis, this doesn't look so good anymore, right? If we're doubling down on beginner to intermediate tutorials, that's not going to solve any of these hidden problems, right? The real strategy here, and the real friction, first of all, is that they're not having a problem getting started. They are having a problem in scaling to production. And people are disengaging right at the moment where you should be deepening adoption, and that's because the resources aren't helping them with the real problem, right? So in this context, your real focus should actually be on building production-focused setup guides, Kubernetes, GPU compatibility, that sort of thing, right? So let me show this to you now that we've sort of learned the iceberg. Let's look at it through one more lens. In this case, it's a case study of a project that we worked on. So a couple years ago, when Meta was first launching React Native, PyTorch, Fair, Llama, a lot of these things which are now household names, there was initial buzz, right? There was lots of great mentions on social media, and they noticed an early spike in stars and forks, but this wasn't lining up to actual usage numbers, right? And they were confused about this. Why is there uneven adoption? It's unclear to us why people are disengaging in spite of all this buzz we're getting on the media and social media. So when they came to us with this problem, we suggested a solution that involved looking for what's at the lowest, like the deepest level of the iceberg, right? We built a tool to help them track some of this publicly visible sentiment from their developers, monitoring conversations or sort of gathering sentiment analysis from the channels that matter: GitHub, Reddit, Stack Overflow, Hacker News, X, YouTube, Slack, figuring that if we could figure out the sentiment, or if we could find some of the undocumented things about reoccurring questions or adoption, friction or trust signals, this might actually tell the full story. So, looking at what we saw on the surface, the preliminary read around high mentions and excitement was that, hey, we're winning the share of voice. Launches are landing. Contributors are pretty excited about the tech, right? But they looked through the iceberg a little bit and saw, engagement actually isn't quite as evenly distributed. Developers keep asking for the same basic resources that we thought were crystal clear to them, and they're not finding them. Or conversations around licensing are making people confused about what they do or don't own if they're using this tool. And of course, tracking was revealing declining mentions despite of the fact that overall metrics were good, right? It seemed like things were waning, a good facade, but they weren't clear, right? And this is where we came in with the interesting research from the Developer Signal Hub, which is where we learned a couple crucial things. There were abandoned GitHub issues and pull requests, and this was showing pretty clearly that developers were hitting a wall with framework-specific integrations, and they were asking for help on Reddit, and the perception was that Meta was not listening to them, right? That nobody's going to be here to support this. One quote said, "Meta open source projects often neglect the issues and they don't care about community feedback," right? So it's pretty clear now that the issue wasn't limited visibility, it was actually limitations in trust. Developers were excited by the idea of this, but they weren't necessarily bought into the idea that Meta was actually going to be there to support them long term if they wanted to build anything seriously with it, right? As you all know, most of these things are household names by now. We can't take full credit for the way that they turned this around, but they did certainly double down on grabbing some of these workarounds that were being documented off platform and talking in more depth about what was going on, just to make it clear that they were here to support this and that this was something that they were listening to. They cared about their community and they were there to help them, right? So, what does this all mean? How does this relate to your own project? I feel like a broken record at this point when I say this, but good teaching repeats things a bunch of times, hopefully. Don't stop at stars and forks, right? Again, I don't mean to criticize those as ways to learn, but they are great mostly as a pulse check, but they very seldom tell the full story, right? Maybe these are vanity analytics that are good for investors or good to show that people are buzzing, but if other things are happening, they don't always make it that easy for you to figure it out. So look for repeated signals, right? Pay attention to questions that keep coming up. Pay attention to abandoned pull requests or friction or patterns and things that keep happening, right? Because these are actually telling the real story, right? And of course, that leads to tracing context, not just counts, right? Ask why every time. Why are contributors adopting this? Why are they dropping off? Not just how many people are contributing and when, right? And then if there's hidden workarounds that are happening off platform, document those and shout out the people that are sharing them, right? Because that makes them feel like valued members of the community, but also that helps everybody to see, hey, we're not the only people that are using this. We are grateful to other people figuring out the solutions and sharing them with us, right? And finally, I would encourage you to do regular sweeps for this types of insight, right? Don't wait until suddenly it looks like nobody's using this, or suddenly we have a bug that wasn't documented, everyone's leaving or looking for an alternative solution. Even if it's just monthly or even quarterly, right? Light sweeps to sort of see, hey, where's friction? What's the sentiment like? All that type of stuff is a great place to start, right? So my framing line for this whole talk is success is not just about visibility of your tools or your platforms or your products. It's about listening to the signals that are coming from your community, listening to the signals that they're already sending you, gathering those and turning those things into actions that are going to make your project stronger. You may have seen my colleagues and me or people carrying our swag around this conference and wondered what this was all about. And final thought here, we were gathering information on how developers behave because we want to know. We want to be able to help provide this type of guidance, right? A number of questions that have come up to me at my booth here over the last couple of days is, how do you know how developers behave? The way that we know is by listening to real developers, right? We record them, we talk to them, we look for insights. And so if you'd like, you can take a quick 5-question survey that's pretty light here and figure out which one of these sort of like, it's almost like a Myers-Briggs test for your developer type, and you could figure out which one of these little characters depicts you the best. But also, these are not just going into the void for us. We're gathering these because we want to share this information to help people like you understand developer audiences best, right? That's pretty much all that I've got here. If you've got questions, we've got plenty of time. But thank you so much for attending. And as I said, if you want, we've got swag with these characters on them in the back. But also we've even got, I think, some Persona stickers left up at our booth if you want to visit us upstairs too. Thank you for stopping by. I'll be here to answer any questions. Or does anybody have any questions now while we're all here? Cool. I'll hang around if you want to talk to me, but thank you very much.